I walked into the restaurant at 10:30 on a Saturday morning, sunlight already bright through the front windows, thinking this was just a group brunch. Instead of 5 friends, I found a woman trying to explain the words Eggs Benedict to a 5-year-old holding his menu upside down, his small feet kicking against the chair legs while he studied the pictures like they might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. His brow furrowed in the exact serious expression small children use when they're determined not to be tricked. Then I looked up and saw 4 of my friends crouched behind a support column near the coffee bar, phones pointed straight at me, doing a poor job of pretending they weren't there. I looked at them. They were waiting for me to look annoyed. I looked back at the woman and the kid, and I pulled out a chair and sat down. My name is Ryan Calloway. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a civil engineer here in San Diego, California. Mostly infrastructure projects, retaining walls, drainage systems, the kind of work that spends more time outdoors on job sites than behind a desk. I studied at San Diego State, took my first job with a firm downtown right out of college, and never seriously considered leaving the city, which turned out to matter more than I realized at the time. My whole professional network, every reference I'd ever need, all of it rooted in one place I hadn't planned around leaving. It wasn't a lack of ambition. I just never felt the pull toward somewhere else that some people seem to carry around their whole lives, that restless sense that the good version of their life is happening in a different zip code. I like the work precisely because it doesn't leave room for ambiguity, unlike most of the rest of life, which seems to run almost entirely on it. You pour a foundation correctly, the building stands. You get it wrong, eventually something fails. There's a clean relationship between effort and outcome that most of the rest of life doesn't offer, and I've always found some comfort in that, especially during the stretches of my life where everything else felt considerably less predictable, where the variables refused to stay put, no matter how carefully I tried to account for them. 18 months before that Saturday morning, my girlfriend of 3 years, Lauren, and I ended things. Not because either of us did anything wrong. She'd gotten an opportunity in New York she genuinely wanted, a promotion that would have been foolish to turn down. And I wasn't willing to leave San Diego, a city I'd built my entire adult life around. My job, my friends, even my parents living 40 minutes away. We'd talked about the future before, in the vague, comfortable way couples do without ever really testing whether their visions actually lined up, and it wasn't until the offer landed in her inbox that we found out they didn't. We tried the long-distance conversation for about a week before we both admitted it wasn't realistic, not the way we actually wanted it to be, both of us too honest with each other to pretend a video call every night would sustain something that needed a lot more than that. It wasn't a dramatic ending. There were no accusations, no late-night arguments that ran until sunrise. It was just 2 people wanting different things at the same moment in their lives, which somehow made it harder to be angry about and easier to actually grieve. You can't direct your frustration at someone for wanting a reasonable thing you simply can't give them. I didn't rush to fill the space afterward. I live alone in a midtown apartment, keep it fairly minimal. A rolled-up set of engineering drawings usually sitting on the kitchen table. A coffee maker that's honestly the nicest thing I own, purchased in a moment of mild extravagance that I've never once regretted. The kind of appliance that makes getting up early on job site mornings marginally more bearable. My friends, Marcus, Jess, Derek, and Priya, all of us going back to college, all of us having watched each other through breakups, job changes, and the slow drift into actual adulthood, started worrying, somewhere around the 6-month mark, that I was closing myself off. Marcus works behind the bar at a place downtown, has for going on 6 years now, moved up to manager, but still pulls shifts himself most weekends. Jess does marketing for a tech company that changes names every couple years through some merger or another. Derek's in IT, quiet about it in the way people who spend all day fixing other people's problems tend to be once they clock out. Priya keeps the books for a handful of small businesses around the city, the most organized person any of us know by a wide margin. They're a loud, well-meaning group, the kind of friends who genuinely care, but occasionally mistake caring for having the right to intervene without asking, a distinction that took all of us a while to properly untangle. They set me up 5 separate times over the following year. 5 separate dead ends, mostly because I wasn't actually looking, and they eventually stopped listening to that particular explanation, deciding instead that the problem must be something else, timing, or nerves, or simply needing the right push from people who knew better than I apparently did. Then Jess texted me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was standing in the middle of a job site, dust on my boots, checking rebar placement. Saturday brunch. Everyone needs to see your face. I said yes, mostly because it had been a while since the 5 of us were all in the same place at the same time, and because Jess had a way of making a simple request sound slightly guilt-inducing if you didn't comply. No other details were offered. I had no reason to ask for any, no reason at all to suspect the morning would involve anything beyond eggs, coffee, and the usual back-and-forth ribbing that came with the 5 of us being in a room together. I want to be clear. My friends aren't bad people. They're just the type who treat someone else's loneliness as a problem that needs solving, usually without asking the person whose loneliness it actually is, operating on the assumption that good intentions excuse whatever method gets used to act on them. It's a specific flavor of well-meaning recklessness that I've come to recognize in all 4 of them individually, even though each one expresses it differently. Jess, through relentless persistence, Marcus through half-baked schemes, Derek through his particular gift for saying too much after 2 drinks, Priya through a kind of blunt honesty that occasionally lands wrong. Somehow, across all 4 of them, the underlying instinct was always the same. They wanted good things for me and had no idea how to actually deliver them without making a mess of it first. I walked into the restaurant and saw a woman sitting alone at a table with a young boy, and before I understood anything else about the situation, before I understood any of the planning, the phones, the bet apparently riding on my reaction, I understood that. To understand what actually happened that Saturday, and why my reaction wasn't what anybody had planned for, you have to sit through the 2 hours that followed. Small moments accumulating one after another, none of them dramatic on their own, all of them adding up to something none of us at that table had expected walking in. It's worth saying, too, that I didn't know anything about the plan going into that morning. I had no advance warning, no hint from any of them that this brunch was anything other than what Jess had described. Whatever surprise everyone else was managing that morning, mine was just as real as theirs. I simply processed it differently than they'd anticipated. I pulled out the chair because it was the most natural thing to do. There was a woman sitting alone with a young child at the table I'd apparently been directed toward, the hostess pointing me that way without comment, and something in me simply responded to that rather than to whatever performance was supposedly unfolding around us. It wasn't a decision made for anyone's benefit, wasn't calculated as some display of good character. It was just the obvious thing. The thing you do when someone appears to be waiting for you and you have no reason not to sit down. I've thought about that moment a lot since, trying to figure out if there was some deeper impulse behind it. And honestly, there wasn't. It really was that simple. She looked up at me, sizing me up in the brief, efficient way I'd later come to recognize as entirely characteristic of her. "You're Ryan? I'm Elena. And this is Mateo, who is currently trying to locate pizza somewhere on a brunch menu. Her tone carried a specific dryness, the kind you develop when you spend your days managing small humans and have learned to narrate the absurdity of it out loud rather than let it build up unspoken. Mateo looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just looked, the way 5-year-olds do when they're deciding whether an adult is worth their attention, holding his laminated menu upside down without seeming to notice or care. His dark hair sticking up slightly on one side like he'd slept on it wrong. A small stuffed dinosaur peeking out from the top of his backpack on the chair beside him. I've never known exactly how to handle myself around small children, so instinct took over. I picked up my paper napkin and folded it into the rough shape of a rabbit, something I'd learned years earlier from a Japanese site foreman during an internship who used to fold napkins to pass time during lunch breaks on a construction crew, a small skill that had sat dormant in my hands for years without ever finding an occasion to use itself, something I hadn't even consciously remembered knowing until my fingers just started moving. I set it down in front of Mateo without saying anything about it. Mateo's mouth opened, a small, involuntary expression of delight he clearly wasn't trying to hide. Elena looked at me in a way she clearly hadn't planned on looking at anyone that morning, something recalibrating quickly behind her eyes. Over the following 2 hours, a handful of things settled into place that I only fully understood the significance of much later. Elena didn't talk about herself much. She asked me questions instead, about my work, about growing up in San Diego, about whether I liked it here, about what it was actually like to build things for a living, whether I ever drove past a finished project and felt something specific looking at it. I noticed, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, that this was someone who used questions as a way of not having to answer any herself, deflecting attention with practiced ease, the kind of skill you only develop after enough people have asked you things you didn't want to explain, after enough well-meaning strangers have wanted the full story of how you ended up raising a child alone. I didn't push. It seemed like the kind of thing that would come out eventually if it was going to come out at all, and rushing it would only teach her I was another person who couldn't wait. She kept an eye on Mateo constantly, not in an anxious way, just a practiced one. She knew when he needed water, when he was about to get restless, when he needed a moment of direct attention, all without ever losing the thread of what we were talking about, cutting a sentence perfectly in half to redirect him and then picking it back up exactly where she'd left off, a skill that must have taken years to develop into something so seamless. It was the kind of split awareness that only comes from doing something for years without a break. The specific multitasking of someone who's never had the luxury of being fully off duty, not even during something as low stakes as a Saturday brunch. I found myself, without meaning to, tracking the same things she was tracking, matching her rhythm without ever discussing it. At one point, Mateo asked what I did for work. I told him I built things. He asked very seriously, "Houses for who?" I paused for a second, caught off guard by the directness of the question, then said, "Lots of people. I haven't met most of them yet." He nodded like this was a completely satisfactory answer, the kind of gravity only a 5-year-old can bring to a simple sentence, filing the information away with total seriousness, as though he'd just confirmed something important about how the world worked. Elena watched that whole exchange with an expression I couldn't quite name at the time. Something soft. Something she seemed to be actively working not to show too openly, her fingers pausing mid-motion around her own coffee cup. Halfway through, right as Mateo was explaining, with total confidence why dinosaurs would definitely win in a fight against sharks, Marcus appeared at the table, phone lowered, looking somewhere between amused and genuinely uncomfortable, the discomfort of someone realizing partway through a plan that the plan might not have been entirely well thought out. He introduced the rest of the group, still hovering a few feet back near the window: Jess, Derek, and Priya, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from a delighted to sheepish. Depending on how much of the situation they'd already worked out was landing differently than expected, Jess still holding her phone up, though she'd clearly forgotten to actually press record. I looked at all of them. Phones, half-guilty smiles, the particular body language of people caught in the act of something they'd planned to be funny and were now reconsidering in real time, none of them quite sure whether to laugh, apologize, or simply back away from the table entirely. "You guys were filming me?" I asked, keeping my voice level, more curious than confrontational. "Not exactly. We thought you'd react differently," Marcus said, glancing at Jess for backup that didn't come, his usual confidence noticeably absent under the weight of the moment. Differently how? Nobody had a good answer for that. Derek actually looked down at his phone like the screen might supply him with the right words. Priya opened her mouth, closed it again, apparently thinking better of whatever she'd been about to offer. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly annoyed, though I understood, even in the moment, that some version of me might have been justified in feeling that way. A version I simply wasn't inhabiting at that particular table on that particular morning. I looked at my friends, then at Elena, who had clearly just put together the same picture I had, her expression shifting from confusion to something more guarded. I flagged down the server for another round of coffee, mostly because it seemed like the situation could use a minute to settle before anyone said anything they'd regret. "I'm sorry," Elena said, lowering her voice slightly, glancing quickly toward Mateo to make sure he was still absorbed in his menu and not listening. "I had no idea this was—" "You didn't know either?" I asked, genuinely surprised, since I'd assumed until that moment that she'd been in on it from the start, that maybe this whole thing had been her idea as much as theirs. "I thought this was just brunch. Marcus mentioned some friends might come by. He said nothing about whatever this actually is." "It is brunch," I said. And somehow that was true enough that neither of us needed to say anything else about it right then, the absurdity of the whole setup somehow resolving itself into something almost funny as we'd both acknowledged we'd been equally in the dark. Elena actually laughed then, a short, surprised sound, like the tension had finally found somewhere to go. By the end, Elena paid for her own check before I could reach for it, waving off my attempt with a small, firm shake of her head that told me arguing further wasn't going to accomplish anything, then leaned down to gather Mateo's things: his jacket, a small backpack shaped like a dinosaur that had been sitting on the empty chair beside him the whole meal, its zipper pull chewed slightly at one corner from some habit Mateo had probably picked up months earlier. Mateo looked up at me. "Can you fold another bunny?" "Mateo, that's enough," Elena said, though there was no real edge to it, more habit than genuine correction. I handed him the one already sitting on the table, its ears slightly crushed from 2 hours of sitting on the tablecloth. "You can keep this one." Something in Elena's expression shifted watching that exchange. A man who didn't need an explanation for doing the simple, obvious thing. And for the first time in a while, she didn't seem in a hurry to leave, lingering an extra moment by the table even after everything had been gathered. Mateo already halfway through explaining the rabbit's name to nobody in particular. 3 months after that brunch, I'd texted Elena a few times, mostly just to ask if Mateo still had the rabbit, half expecting no response at all given how the morning had ended. She wrote back, casual at first, then gradually less so, her replies growing longer and arriving faster each time, until what had started as a single question about a napkin rabbit had somehow become an ongoing conversation. Neither of us seemed inclined to let go quiet. Eventually, we were texting about ordinary things, a project I was working on, one of her students. Mateo learning to read. A book she was trying to get him interested in that he kept insisting was too easy, even though it clearly wasn't. We saw each other 2 more times after that, always as a group, never alone, the 2 of us circling something neither of us had named yet. Both of us apparently comfortable letting it develop at whatever pace it wanted to develop at. Once, at a barbecue Jess hosted, Mateo fell asleep against my shoulder halfway through the evening, worn out from chasing Priya's dog around the yard for an hour straight, and Elena just left him there rather than moving him, which felt like its own quiet kind of statement. One evening at Marcus's bar, a Thursday, I'd stopped by after work without any particular plan, tired from a long day on a site inspection and looking forward to nothing more complicated than a beer and some quiet. Derek had a couple too many and started retelling the whole plan to someone sitting near him at the bar, not realizing Elena and I were at the next table over, close enough that every word carried clearly despite the ambient noise of the evening crowd. And we figured Ryan would totally freak out seeing a kid there. You know, single mom. Whole situation. But he folds this little napkin rabbit and hands it to the kid like it's nothing. And we're all standing there like idiots with our phones out. And Jess almost drops hers. She's laughing so hard, except it's not even funny. It's just weirdly sweet. And none of us knew what to do with that. I heard all of it. Every word landed with a specific clarity that made the rest of the bar seem to go quiet around it, even though nothing had actually changed in the room. The ambient noise, the music, the clink of glasses, all of it continuing exactly as before, while something inside me went very still. I glanced at Elena. Her expression hadn't changed, but her hand had stopped mid-motion around her glass, and I understood, watching that small stillness, that she'd caught every word too, that whatever comfortable rhythm we'd built over the last 3 months had just hit something neither of us had anticipated. I pulled Marcus aside afterward, out to the small patio behind the bar, where the noise from inside dropped to a low hum, string lights strung overhead that Marcus had put up himself 2 summers earlier and never taken down. A couple of empty crates stacked near the back door where deliveries usually got dropped off. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him, waiting, letting the silence sit there long enough that he understood I wasn't going to fill it for him. "What did you actually think I'd do, seeing a kid at that table?" I asked, genuinely wanting to understand the reasoning, not just make him uncomfortable. "We didn't know. Maybe you'd think it was funny. Or," Marcus started, his usual easy confidence noticeably absent. "You used Elena and Mateo as props in your own joke." Marcus didn't say anything. He looked down at the concrete, then back up at me, clearly searching for a version of the explanation that would sound better out loud than it had in his head. Behind him, through the window, I could see Jess and Derek watching us from the bar, both of them pretending very hard not to be watching. "I'm not upset about the prank," I told him, and I meant it. "I'm upset because Elena might not have known she was getting used that way. She thought she was going to a normal brunch. Instead, she became the punchline in a bet you guys apparently made about how I'd react. Did any of you stop to think about what it looks like from her side? Showing up somewhere with her kid and finding out later she was basically an unwitting prop? Priya, thinking Elena deserved to know the full truth so she could protect herself going forward, told her everything before I got the chance to explain it myself, calling her the next afternoon with what she probably believed was an act of loyalty, rather than an act that would end up costing me 2 days of silence I hadn't earned. Elena thanked her for the honesty, and then went quiet on me for 2 full days, my texts sitting unanswered in a way that felt entirely different from the easy back and forth we'd built over the previous months, each unanswered message accumulating a small weight of its own. I understood exactly why. Even as it left me sitting with a version of uncertainty I hadn't expected to feel this far into whatever we'd started building, checking my phone more than I'd normally admit to, wondering each time whether the silence meant she was thinking it through or had already decided. I didn't think she was angry at me specifically. I think she was angry that, once again, her circumstances had become the punchline in someone else's story, a role she hadn't agreed to and hadn't asked for, the same role, in different forms, that she'd probably been assigned by other people more times than she'd ever wanted to count. Elena isn't a supporting character in anyone's life, but my friends had turned her into one in their own joke. And what bothered me most wasn't that they'd done it to me. It was that they'd done it to her, without her knowledge or consent, treating her actual life as raw material for their entertainment. She'd spent years building a life carefully, protecting Mateo and herself from exactly this kind of casual carelessness, and my own friends had walked right past all of that without even noticing it was there, too caught up in the entertainment value of the moment to consider the actual person sitting at that table. I didn't text Elena. I knew if I did, she might say she didn't need to talk, might handle the whole thing with a polite, closed-off response that would settle nothing between us. So instead, I bought 2 coffees and waited outside her school after the last bell, standing near the gate with the 2 cups going lukewarm in my hands, while kids streamed past me toward waiting cars and buses, a couple of them eyeing me with the mild suspicion kids reserve for unfamiliar adults loitering near school property. She came out and saw me, not shocked, just tired in the specific way people get tired of being let down, her expression carrying the particular weariness of someone bracing for a conversation she'd rather not have, but knew was coming. Eventually, backpack slung over one shoulder, the last few of her students being collected by parents in the pickup lane behind her, one of her colleagues waving goodbye to her from across the lot without noticing me standing there. "I don't want an apology," she said, before I'd even fully crossed the distance between us, her voice steady, but carrying an edge I hadn't heard from her before. "I'm not here to apologize for them," I told her, holding out one of the coffees, my hand steady even though the rest of me wasn't entirely sure how this conversation was going to go. "I'm here because I want to know what you're actually thinking." She took the coffee, but didn't say anything for a moment, looking past me toward the parking lot rather than at me directly. She didn't bring up the prank at all. She said something else entirely, something that had clearly been sitting in her for longer than the 2 days since Priya's call. "I've spent years teaching myself, and Mateo, not to get attached to people who might just disappear. His father left before he was even born, walked away the moment things got real, and never looked back, not even a phone call on birthdays. I've been careful, deliberately careful, about who gets close enough to matter to him, screening every person who enters our life for exactly this risk. And then you fold that stupid rabbit, and he goes home asking me when he gets to see you again. That scared me more than any prank could, because it means he's already attached, and I don't know what happens if you're just another person who was there for one funny brunch story and then gone. Another name he'll ask about months from now, and I won't have a good answer for. Another gap in his life I'll have to explain in a way that doesn't hurt as much as the truth." I listened without interrupting, without rushing to explain myself or defend my friends or offer reassurances she hadn't asked for yet, letting her get all the way through what she needed to say before I responded to any of it, the 2 of us standing there while the school parking lot slowly emptied around us. When she finished, I said, "I don't know exactly where this goes. I can't promise you certainty, because nobody honestly can, not about anything worth having. But I know that over the last 3 months, the days I texted you were the best days I had. And I want you to know that has nothing to do with any of their joke. That part was real before I even understood it was happening, before I would have admitted it to myself if you'd asked me directly. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I just needed you to hear that. She took a sip of the coffee, still not quite looking at me, both hands wrapped around the cup, like she needed something to hold on to, looked straight ahead for a moment, toward the emptying parking lot, the last few kids being collected by parents. Didn't say anything else, but she didn't leave either. She stayed standing there beside me, the silence between us feeling less like distance now, and more like two people simply taking their time. The parking lot behind her now completely empty, the last car pulling away somewhere off in the distance. "Can I ask where you learned to fold napkins like that?" she finally said, a slight shift in her tone, something lighter finding its way back in. "Job site. Japanese foreman named Hiroshi. He used to fold these elaborate little animals during lunch breaks to pass the time, and I picked up maybe 3 of them over 2 summers. It's a long story, mostly boring. He said his grandmother taught him back in Osaka, and he taught it to bored college interns who had nothing better to do while waiting for concrete trucks." A small smile crossed her face, the first one I'd seen since Derek's confession 3 days earlier, small but genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes in a way that felt like something had actually settled between us. It wasn't a resolution exactly. It was more like a door that had been shut a crack opening again. Not all the way, but enough that I could tell the two of us weren't finished, that whatever this was would continue past that particular Friday. We started again slowly, deliberately, without rushing anything. Both of us apparently in silent agreement that whatever this was deserved more care than the chaotic way it had begun. We met once more as a group, a cookout at my apartment complex's small courtyard this time. This time I invited everyone, so nobody felt singled out. And this time the invitation was mine to extend rather than something orchestrated behind my back. Elena came with Mateo. My friends kept their phones in their pockets that time, having clearly absorbed the lesson from 3 months earlier, and the whole evening had an easier, less charged quality to it than that first Saturday morning. Even Derek, still visibly embarrassed weeks after his slip at the bar, went out of his way to spend a solid 20 minutes talking dinosaurs with Mateo, apparently his own version of an apology, coming away from the conversation with a genuine, if slightly bewildered, respect for how much a 5-year-old could know about the Cretaceous period. Mateo and I settled into something easy over the following weeks, an unhurried rhythm neither of us forced. I never tried to be anything in particular to him. I was just the guy who folded animals out of napkins, and that seemed to be enough for him. An entire relationship built on paper cranes and elephants and whatever else I could figure out from watching video tutorials late at night, more invested in learning new folds than I probably would have admitted to anyone. He liked asking about my job, what I'd built that day, whether it was tall, whether anyone could see it from the freeway, whether it would still be standing when he was a grown-up. A question that always made me pause slightly before answering, aware that whatever I said might become part of how he understood permanence and impermanence long before he had the language for either concept. I gave him honest answers. Poured concrete today. Not that exciting, but it matters, because nothing else in the building works without it being solid first. He'd nod at that like it was a perfectly reasonable update, filing it away with the same seriousness he gave everything, occasionally repeating some fragment of it back to Elena later, garbled but recognizable, like he'd been carrying it around all afternoon, proud of himself for retaining a piece of adult information nobody had quizzed him on. Elena and I started meeting for coffee on Friday afternoons when Mateo was with his grandmother, at a small place 2 blocks from her apartment that made a cortado she swore by, a standing arrangement that emerged gradually rather than being formally proposed by either of us. The first time, I think we both showed up half expecting it to be a one-off. By the 4th or 5th Friday, neither of us bothered pretending that anymore, and I'd started rearranging my own work schedule quietly to make sure Fridays stayed clear. We didn't put a name on it. It was just Friday, coffee, and 2 people talking longer than the coffee actually required, the conversation stretching from 30 minutes into 2 hours without either of us noticing the time passing. The barista eventually learning both our orders without needing to ask. She told me more about Mateo's father eventually, not dwelling on it, just laying out the facts plainly, the way she seemed to approach most difficult things. A man who'd been excited about the pregnancy for exactly 6 weeks before deciding he wasn't. I told her more about Lauren, about the specific ache of loving someone and still knowing you wanted different lives, 2 very different kinds of loss sitting comfortably across the table from each other without either of us needing to compare whose had been worse. Both of us understanding, without saying it outright, that comparison wasn't the point, that loss doesn't work on a scale that measures one person's grief against another's. My friends changed, too, in their own ways, over that same stretch of months, each of them handling the awkwardness of the situation a little differently once the dust had settled, once the joke had stopped being funny even to them. Marcus apologized to Elena directly, showing up at her school one afternoon with an unprompted, genuinely uncomfortable admission of exactly how badly he'd handled the whole thing, standing there in the same spot outside the gate where I'd waited weeks earlier, fidgeting the entire time like a man twice his age, suddenly unsure of himself. And she accepted it, telling him she appreciated that he'd come himself instead of sending it through someone else. Jess asked me, a few weeks later, sitting across from me at a diner we'd been going to since college, if I needed space. The same question she'd probably asked a dozen times over the past year and a half. I told her no, for the first time, meaning it differently than before. I don't need space. I just need time. She seemed to actually hear the distinction that time, something registering behind her expression that hadn't quite landed in previous conversations, and she reached over and squeezed my arm once before changing the subject to something lighter, the old easy rhythm between us settling back into place. 10 months after that first brunch, it's a Saturday morning again, the same day of the week, roughly the same time of morning, though neither of us planned it that way, but this time in my own kitchen instead of that restaurant. Mateo is eating breakfast at the counter, legs swinging from the bar stool that's slightly too tall for him, his cereal bowl decorated with a cartoon he still refuses to explain to me. Elena is reading something at the table with a mug of coffee cooling beside her, and I'm making a second pot because the first one somehow wasn't enough this morning. "Ryan, what are you folding today?" Mateo asks, not even looking up from his cereal, already anticipating the ritual. I take a napkin and fold it into an elephant, something new I'd learned the week before from a video that took me 3 attempts to get right, and set it beside his bowl. "Whoa! Mom! Ryan made an elephant!" He holds it up triumphantly, examining it from every angle before setting it carefully next to his juice glass, already announcing he's going to bring it to show and sell on Monday. Elena doesn't look up from her book, but she's smiling. The specific, quiet smile she gets when something ordinary and good is happening around her, and she doesn't feel the need to comment on it directly. There's no big declaration in that moment. No dramatic kiss, no speech, nothing that would have made for a better story if I were exaggerating any of it for effect, though people always seem a little disappointed when I tell them that's genuinely how it happened. Just a Saturday morning in a kitchen, Mateo asking questions, me answering them, and Elena drinking her coffee in comfortable quiet, all three of us occupying the same warm, unremarkable morning together, sunlight coming in low through the window over the sink. I think back to that first day. The rabbit sat down in front of Mateo without a word, no plan behind it beyond simple instinct. I had no idea at the time that this was where it would all start, that a folded napkin would end up being the first sentence in a much longer conversation. If you'd told me that morning, sitting down at a table I hadn't chosen, that I'd be standing in this kitchen 10 months later, I probably would have laughed and gone back to my coffee. My friends thought this was going to be the funniest prank of the year. They never expected my surprising reaction to just be pulling out a chair and sitting down. Honestly, I don't think there was ever a version of the plan where they'd considered that outcome at all. Every version they'd apparently discussed beforehand involved me being flustered, or awkward, or bolting for the door within 10 minutes. Marcus later admitted they'd actually placed a small bet on which of those three I'd do first. What actually shocked them wasn't that I didn't get upset. It was that I looked at Elena and Mateo and didn't see a complicated situation. I just saw two people sitting at a table, waiting. The way anyone waits for something without necessarily knowing what shape it's going to take. There was nothing in that scene that required a dramatic reaction, and I think my friends had spent so long imagining single motherhood as some kind of complication to be managed that they never considered someone might just look at it plainly, without the baggage they'd apparently attached to it on my behalf. I've wondered since whether that says more about them than about me, some assumption baked in that a woman with a kid comes preloaded with problems, rather than just being a person like anyone else, worth getting to know on her own terms. It's a small bias, maybe, but it shapes a lot of decisions people don't even realize they're making. Mateo has a collection of 12 paper animals now, lined up on a shelf in his room in an order that apparently matters deeply to him, though he's never fully explained the logic behind it beyond insisting the elephant has to go next to the rabbit because they're friends. Elena tells me he rearranges them almost weekly, adjusting some internal social hierarchy only he understands. I recently learned how to fold a crocodile, which took considerably more attempts than the elephant did. 3 ruined napkins before I finally got the jaw to sit right, with Mateo watching each failed attempt and offering unhelpful but enthusiastic critique. Sometimes I've come to believe the best parts of your life don't start with a decision you consciously make. They start with the moment you simply don't walk away. The small, unremarkable choice to stay seated when leaving would have been just as easy, when nobody would have blamed you for standing up and finding somewhere else to be. So let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into something you assumed would be complicated, only to realize it was actually just ordinary? As long as you didn't run from it? As long as you gave it the same plain, unhurried attention you'd give anything else? And what's the most unexpected reaction you've ever had in a moment when everyone was watching to see how you'd respond? When the room seemed to be holding its breath for a particular version of you to show up, and you gave them something else entirely, something quieter than they'd bargained for? Tell me in the comments, if you'd been sitting where I was that morning, chair pulled out, phones pointed at you from behind a support column, what would you have done? Like this video, if you believe the right response is sometimes just pulling out a chair and sitting down, no speech required, no grand gesture, just showing up as the version of yourself that was already there. And subscribe, because next week I've got another story about ordinary people and the moments nobody saw coming until they were already living inside them.